Continuing Alexander, from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. The eunuch confirmed all he said with solemn and dreadful oaths, and was further enlarging upon Alexander's moderation and magnanimity on other occasions, when Darius, breaking away from him into the other division of the tent, where his friends and courtiers were, lifted up his hands to heaven, and uttered this prayer: "Ye gods," said he, "of my family and of my kingdom, if it be possible, I beseech you to restore the declining affairs of Persia, that I may leave them in as flourishing a condition as I found them, and have it in my power to make a grateful return to Alexander for the kindness which in my adversity he has shown to those who are dearest to me. But if indeed the fatal time has come, which is to give a period to the Persian monarchy, if our ruin be a debt that must be paid to the divine jealousy and vicissitude of things, then I beseech you, grant that no other man but Alexander may sit upon the throne of Cyrus," called Kurash in Semitic and Persian sources, also called Zul or Dhul Qarnayn. Such is the narrative given by the greater number of historians. But to return to Alexander, after he had reduced all Asia on this side of the Euphrates, he advanced towards Darius, who was coming down against him with 1,000,000 of men. In his march, a very ridiculous passage happened. The servants who followed the camp for sport's sake divided themselves into 2 parties, and named the commander of one of them Alexander and the other Darius. At first they only pelted one another with clods of earth, but presently took to their fists, and at last, heated with contention, they fought in good earnest with stones and clubs, so that they had much ado to part them, till Alexander, upon hearing of it, ordered the 2 captains to decide and quarrel by single combat, and armed him who bore his name himself, while Philotas did the same to him who represented Darius. The whole army were spectators of this encounter, willing, from the event of it, to derive an omen of their future success. After they had fought stoutly a pretty long while, at last he who was called Alexander had the better, and for a reward of his prowess had 12 villages given him, with leave to wear the Persian dress. So we are told by Eratosthenes. But the great battle of all that was fought with Darius was not, as most writers tell us, at Arbela, but at Gaugamela, which, in their language, signifies the camel's house, forasmuch as one of their ancient kings, having escaped the pursuit of his enemies on a swift camel, in gratitude to his beast, settled him at this place, with an allowance of certain villages and rents for his maintenance. It came to pass that in the month of Boedramion, about the beginning of the Feast of the Mysteries at Athens, there was an eclipse of the moon, the 11th night, after which, the 2 armies being now in view of one another, Darius kept his men in arms, and by torchlight took a general review of them. But Alexander, while his soldiers slept, spent the night before his tent, with his diviner Aristander, performing certain mysterious ceremonies and sacrificing to the entity Fear. In the meanwhile, the oldest of his commanders, and chiefly Parmenio, when they beheld all the plain between Niphatus and Gordaan mountains shining with the lights and fires which were made by the barbarians, and heard the uncertain and confused sounds of voices out of their camp, like the distant roaring of a vast ocean, were so amazed at the thoughts of such a multitude that after some confidence among themselves they concluded it an enterprise too difficult and hazardous for them to engage so numerous an enemy in the day, and therefore meeting the king as he came from sacrificing, besought him to attack Darius by night, that the darkness might conceal the danger of the ensuing battle. To this he gave them the celebrated answer, "I will not steal a victory," which, though some at the time thought a boyish and inconsiderate speech, as if he played with danger, others, however, regarded as an evidence that he confided in his present condition and acted on a true judgment of the future. Not wishing to leave Darius, in case he were worried, the pretext of trying his fortune again, which he might suppose himself to have, if he could impute his overthrow to the disadvantage of the night, as he did before to the mountains, the narrow passages, and the sea. For while he had such numerous forces and large dominions still remaining, it was not any want of men or arms that could induce him to give up the war, but only the loss of all courage and hope upon the conviction of an undeniable and manifest defeat. After they were gone from him with this answer, he laid himself down in his tent and slept the rest of the night more soundly than was usual with him, to the astonishment of the commanders, who came to him early in the morning, but were fain themselves to give order that the soldiers should breakfast. But at last, time not giving them leave to wait any longer, Parmenio went to his bedside and called him twice or thrice by his name till he waked him, and then asked him how it was possible, when he was to fight the most important battle of all, he could sleep as soundly as if he were already victorious. "And are we not so inclined," replied Alexander, smiling, "since we are at last relieved from the trouble of wandering in pursuit of Darius through a wide and wasted country, hoping in vain that he would fight us, and not only before the battle, but in the height of the danger he showed himself great, and manifested the self-possession of a just foresight and confidence, for the battle for some time fluctuated and was dubious. The left wing, where Parmenio commanded, was so impetuously charged by the Bactrian horse that it was disordered and forced to give ground, at the same time that Mazaeus had sent a detachment round about to fall upon those who guarded the baggage, which so disturbed Parmenio that he sent messengers to acquaint Alexander that the camp and baggage would be all lost unless he immediately relieved the rear by a considerable reinforcement drawn out of the front. This message being brought him just as he was giving the signal to those about him for the onset, he bade them tell Parmenio that he must have surely lost the use of his reason, and had forgotten in his alarm that soldiers, if victorious, became masters of their enemies' baggage, and if defeated, instead of taking care of their wealth or their slaves, have nothing more to do but fight gallantly and die with honor. When he had said this, he put on his helmet, having the rest of his arms on before he came out of his tent, which were a coat of the Sicilian make, girt close about him, and over that a breastpiece of thickly quilted linen, which was taken among other booty at the battle of Issus. The helmet, which was made by Theophilus, though of iron, was so well wrought and polished that it was as bright as the most refined silver. To this was fitted a gorget of the same metal, set with precious stones. His sword, which was the weapon he most used in fight, was given him by the king of the Gitiaans, and was of an admirable temper and lightness. The belt, which he also wore in all engagements, was of a much richer workmanship than the rest of his armor. It was a work of the ancient Helicon, and had been presented to him by the Rhodians as a mark of their respect to him, so long as he was engaged in drawing up his men, or riding about to give orders or directions, or view them. He spared Bucephalus, who was now growing old, and made use of another horse. But when he was actually to fight, he sent for him again, and as soon as he was mounted, commenced the attack. He made the longest address that day to the Thessalians and other Greeks, who answered him with loud shouts, desiring him to lead them on against the barbarians, upon which he shifted his javelin to his left hand, and with his right lifted up toward heaven, besought what he considered to be gods and goddesses. So is this the word daimon? As Callisthenes tells us, that if he was of that would be plural, right? That if he was of a truth the son of Jupiter, notice the Christian thing comes in the same place. They would be pleased to assist and strengthen the Grecians. At the same time, the augur Aristander, who had a white mantle about him and a crown of gold on his head, rode by and showed them an eagle that soared just over Alexander, and directed his flight towards the enemy, which so animated the beholders that after mutual encouragements and exhortations, the horse charged at full speed, and were followed in a mass by the whole phalanx of the foot. But before they could well come to blows with the first ranks, the barbarians shrunk back, and were hotly pursued by Alexander, who drove that fled before him in the middle of the battle, where Darius himself was in person, whom he saw from a distance over the foremost ranks, conspicuous in the midst of his life guard, a tall and fine-looking man, drawn in a lofty chariot, defended by an abundance of the best horse, who stood close in order about it, ready to receive the enemy. But Alexander's approach was so terrible, forcing those who gave back upon those who yet maintained their ground, that he beat down and dispersed them almost all. Only a few of the bravest and the valiantest opposed the pursuit, who were slain in their king's presence, falling in heaps upon one another, and in the very pangs of death striving to catch hold of the horses. Darius, now seeing all was lost, that those who were placed in front to defend him were broken and beat back upon him, that he could not turn or disengage his chariots without great difficulty, the wheels being clogged and entangled among the dead bodies, which lay in such heaps as not only stopped, but almost covered the horses, and made them rear and grow so unruly that the frightened charioteer could govern them no longer. In this extremity was glad to quit his chariot and his arms, and mounting, it is said, upon a mare that had been taken from her foal, betook himself to flight. But he had not escaped so either, if Parmenio had not sent press messengers to Alexander to desire him to return and assist him against a considerable body of the enemy, which yet stood together and would not give ground. For indeed Parmenio is on all hands accused of having been sluggish and unserviceable in this battle, whether age had impaired his courage, or that, as Callisthenes says, he secretly disliked and envied Alexander's growing greatness. Alexander, though he was not a little vexed to be so recalled and hindered from pursuing his victory, yet concealed the true reason from his men, causing a retreat to be sounded, as if it were too late to continue the execution any longer, marched back towards the place of danger, and by the way met the news of the enemy's total overthrow and flight. The battle being thus over, seems to put a period to the Persian Empire, and Alexander, who was now proclaimed King of Asia, returned thanks to the entities and magnificent sacrifices, and rewarded his friends and followers with great sums of money and places and governments of provinces. Eager to gain honor with the Grecians, he wrote to them that he would have all tyrannies abolished, that they might live free according to their own laws, especially to the Plataeans, that their city should be rebuilt, because their ancestors had permitted their countrymen of old to make their territory the seat of the war when they fought with the barbarians for their common liberty. He sent also part of the spoils into Italy to the Cretanians to honor the zeal and courage of their citizen Phallus, the wrestler who in the Median War, when the other Grecian colonies in Italy disowned the Greek, that he might have a share in the danger, joined the fleet at Salamis with a vessel set forth at his own charge. So affectionate was Alexander to all kinds of virtue, and so desirous to preserve the memory of laudable actions. From hence he marched through the province of Babylon, which immediately submitted to him, and Ecbatana was much surprised at the sight of the place where the fire issues in a continuous stream like a spring of water out of a cleft in the earth, and the stream of Naphtha, which, not far from this spot, flows out so abundantly as to form a sort of lake. This Naphtha, in other respects resembling bitumen, is so subject to take fire that before it touches the flame it will kindle at the very light that surrounds it, and often inflame the intermediate air also. The barbarians, to show the power and nature of it, sprinkled the street that led to the king's lodgings with little drops of it, and when it was almost night, stood at the farther end with torches, which being applied to the moistened places, the first at once taking fire instantly, as quick as a man could think of it, it caught from one end to another, in such a manner that the whole street was one continued flame. Among those who used to wait on the king, and find occasion to amuse him when he anointed and washed himself, there was one Athonophanes, an Athenian, who desired him to make an experiment of the naphtha upon Stephanus, who stood by in the bathing place, a youth with a ridiculously ugly face, beauty in the eye of the beholder, or not, I don't know, whose talent was singing well. For, said he, if you take hold of him and is not put out, it must undeniably be allowed to be part of the most invincible strength. The youth, as it happened, readily consented to undergo the trial. As soon as he was anointed and rubbed with it, his whole body broke out into such a flame, and was so seized by the fire, that Alexander was in the greatest perplexity and alarm for him, but not without reason, for nothing could have prevented his being consumed by it, if by good chance there had not been people at hand with a great many vessels of water for the service of the bath, with all which they had much ado to extinguish the fire, and his body was so burned all over that he was not cured of it for a good while after. Thus, it is not without some plausibility that they endeavor to reconcile the fable to truth, who say this was the drug in the tragedies with which Medea anointed the crown and